What's up everyone? I know a lot of people are going to be wishing for Rosaria, and I know there are going to be a handful of people who end up getting Tartaglia in the process. Maybe you wanted him, maybe you didn't. Either way, I'm here to provide you a cohesive child build guide so you guys know exactly how to build him as a main DPS for melee stance shenanigans, as well as a burst DPS for big PP vaporize damage. His gameplay is super satisfying, but some of his builds require a lot of resources and good artifacts/weapons depending on what your account has at its disposal. There are so many things to cover with this guide, so without further ado, let's get this guide rolling. Tartaglia has one of the most complicated kits in the game, so let me try to break things down here. I'll start with the simple stuff in his talents, then I'll move into the complicated stuff. First, I'm sure you all know that Tartaglia's ability lets him swap between a ranged stance and a melee stance. The longer you stay in melee stance, the longer the cooldown becomes once you exit the melee stance. Once you hit the 30-second mark in melee stance, you automatically return to the ranged stance and the cooldown is increased even more if you use the full timer. In his melee stance, his attacks are converted to hydro damage, and these attacks are still considered normal attack damage, meaning a weapon like Rust is very good on him. Next, his elemental burst has two different effects depending on if you cast the burst in ranged stance or melee stance. For the ranged burst, the AoE hydro damage it deals has a lower multiplier, but it refunds a portion of the energy cost as well as applies the Riptide status to all enemies hit. For the melee burst, the AoE hydro damage has a higher multiplier but does not refund energy, nor does it apply the Riptide status. That was the easy part, and now we're going to get into the complicated stuff. Now I want to talk about the Riptide status. When Tartaglia hits an opponent with a fully charged aim shot, he applies the Riptide status. With his second Ascension passive, getting a crit on an enemy in melee stance also applies the Riptide status. And as I mentioned before, the last way to apply Riptide is to use his elemental burst in ranged stance. So those are the three ways that you can apply Riptide, but what does Riptide actually do? Well, there are four things that can happen once you apply Riptide to an enemy. Listen carefully. Number one, if you hit an enemy marked with Riptide in melee stance, a Riptide slash will occur which deals AoE hydro damage. Once you proc this Riptide slash on an enemy, it has a cooldown of 1.5 seconds before you can proc this Riptide slash again. This damage is considered elemental skill damage, not normal attack damage, so a weapon like the Stringless will increase the damage of this Riptide slash. Number two, if you hit a fully charged aim shot on an enemy marked with Riptide, a Riptide flash will occur, which unleashes a short instance of hydro damage over time. This damage is considered a normal attack damage, not elemental skill damage, therefore a weapon like the Stringless will not increase the damage of this DOT. 3. If Tartaglia uses his melee elemental burst on an enemy with the Riptide status, a Riptide blast will occur, which deals a second instance of AoE hydro damage and cleanses the Riptide status of the enemy hit. This damage is considered elemental burst damage, meaning a weapon like the Stringless will increase this Riptide blast damage. Number 4, lastly, if you defeat an enemy marked by Riptide, the Riptide will spread to other enemies in a certain radius. Alright, that's a lot to soak in, but if you need to rewind to hear the explanation again, feel free to do so. I've also made a super simple flowchart of things as a summary, which should be on screen right now. I'm not sure if it'll help anyone, but hopefully for visual learners it might be something of use. If there's no confusion, let's move into Constellations. Tartaglia's Constellations are weird to say the least, and most of the good ones are locked further down the line, which is partly why I consider him to be an expensive character. Starting with C1, C1 decreases the cooldown of your melee stance by 20%. This constellation is pretty good for the majority of players. As a standalone constellation, it looks really good. But this constellation becomes a lot less useful if you have C6, but for the most part, players don't have C6 Tartaglia aside from Mega Whales, so don't worry about it. C2 grants 4 energy for every enemy that falls with the Riptide status. Energy generation constellations are always nice, but this certainly isn't Childe's best constellation per se. C4 is the complicated constellation since it has to do with the effects of Riptide. With this constellation, if you're in melee stance, every 4 seconds, enemies will take an extra instance of AoE hydro damage as if you just hit them in melee stance. If you're not in melee stance, instead, every 4 seconds, enemies will take the extra AoE hydro DOT as if you just fully charge shot the enemy. Both of these damages are independent of the normal cooldowns of Riptide, and this constellation looks pretty good. I'd say it's one of his better constellations for a main DPS. Lastly, C6 refunds the cooldown of melee stance if you use your elemental burst in melee stance. This basically ensures that you have melee stance up 100% of the time, which is why I say C1 loses value if you have C6. Pretty much all the time you should have enough energy generation to constantly cast burst, whether it be Tartaglia generating his own energy or if you have an energy battery on your team, allowing you to use this constellation to its full potential. Talents and constellations took a ton of time, but alas, there's nothing much I can do about that. Weapons are also pretty complicated for Tartaglia, but I'm sure I can make it through this faster than I did with constellations and talents. I'll rank the weapons in order from best to worst, starting off with a main DPS child, then moving into a burst DPS child. Okay, so for a main DPS child, these are the weapons you want to target in order from best in slot to least optimal. At number 1, we have the Skyward Harp. At number 2, we have the Viridescent Hunt. At number 3, we have the Amos Bow. At number 4, we have Rust/Prototype Crescent. At number 5, we have Blackcliff Warbow. At number 6, we have the Stringless. And at number 7, we have the Windblume Ode. Skyward Harp is light years ahead of every other bow and is 100% your best in slot. Crit rate and crit damage are super important on Childe, and this weapon provides both. Another thing I want to note is that the Amos Bow, Prototype Crescent, and Rust are all better than the Viridescent Hunt in DPS only if you can get 60 to 70 crit rate on Childe with a decent amount of crit damage. That requires insane artifacts with attack percent weapons, which is why I put the Viridescent Hunt above. Using the Viridescent Hunt lowers your artifact requirement by a ton, and it's a fairly cheap option, coming in at only $10 as a Battle Pass reward. The last thing I want to note is the Blackcliff Warbow is placed 5 on this list, but I think it's your best budget option and it might be deserving of a higher spot, but I'll leave it as is. This bow allows you to run a crit rate circlet and eases up on the artifact requirements, and it's a lot like the Viridescent Hunt. Alright, the burst DPS Childe weapons are a bit different, and in my opinion, this is probably the easier way to build Childe. Going from best to worst, we have the R5 Stringless at number 1, Skyward Harp at number 2, the regular Stringless at number 3, the Amos Bow at number 4, the Windblume Ode at number 5, the Viridescent Hunt/Blackcliff Warbow at number 6, and the Rust/Prototype Crescent at number 7. The general best in slot is still going to be Skyward Harp, but if you have an R5 Stringless, it's a very specific option that is also a peak performer on burst DPS Childe. Any other refinement of Stringless is immediately behind the Skyward Harp. The Windblume Ode is a fantastic weapon, but only for a burst DPS Childe. I made a short video testing on why this is the case, so I'm not going to go into detail on that, but if you want to check why that's the case, the video link will be in the description below. Lastly, the Viridescent Hunt and Blackcliff Warbow are very good budget options, and which one you pick depends on your artifact situation. Should be pretty common sense, but choose the weapon based on which crit stat you lack in artifacts. Speaking of artifacts, luckily the artifact options are quite simple on Tartaglia for both builds. Starting with a main DPS Childe, it should be pretty obvious, but the 4-set Heart of Depth is the best in slot. It's almost as if this artifact set was made for him. The other alternatives for a main DPS Childe include the 2-set Gladiator with the 2-set Hydro, or a 2-set Noblesse Oblige with the 2-set Hydro. I don't really see a reason why you wouldn't aim for the full Hydro 4-set, but I figured I'd list a few alternatives. The The substats for a main DPS are very straightforward. The Hourglass always wants attack percent, the Goblet wants Hydro bonus damage, and the Circlet wants crit rate or crit damage, depending on your weapon and substat situation. Note that for a main DPS child, I highly recommend getting at least 60 to 70% crit rate. Riptide is a crucial part of his kit, and in order to apply Riptide in melee stance, you need to crit. As for substats, the order of priority is crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, elemental mastery, and lastly energy recharge. For a burst DPS child, the 4-set Heart of Depth is no longer in the conversation. Your new best in slot will be a 2-set Hydro with a 2-set Noblesse Oblige, which gives us the most elemental burst damage. If you're not running the Stringless or the Windblume Ode, you can also consider the 2-set Noblesse Oblige and the 2-set Wanderer's Troop. Elemental Mastery is a very important stat since we solely use a burst DPS child for vaporize damage. Another set that's alright is the 2-set Gladiator with the 2-set Noblesse Oblige. I wouldn't recommend this one over the other 2 sets that I listed, but it's another option I suppose. For artifact stats, the same stuff I talked about for a main DPS child applies here: attack percent in the Hourglass, Hydro bonus damage in the Goblet, and crit rate or crit damage in the Circlet. Elemental Mastery is an option in the Hourglass slot if you're not running the Windblume Ode or the Stringless. If you are running those 2 weapons, stick to attack percent. Your substat focus also remains the same with crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, EM, and energy recharge. Congrats to anyone who made it through everything in the guide portion. That was probably one of the longest guides, if not the longest guide that I've had to do to this day. If you skipped to this part, then welcome to the showcase, I guess. Anyways, starting with my Tartaglia stats, you can take a look at his attack and elemental mastery right here. If we go deeper into the stats, you can take a look at his crit rate, crit damage, energy recharge, and hydro damage bonus. Notice how my crit rate is only 54%. I know I said you should aim to get at least 60 to 70% on him, but what I do with my Tartaglia is I run him on a team with GOMC, so GOMC increases his crit rate by 10%, making this effectively 64%. For my weapon, we're rocking an R3 Rust, and as for artifact sets, we obviously have a 4-set Heart of Depth. As for substats, we can take a look at the artifacts right here. For Constellations, I have a C0 Tartaglia, and for talents, we have 6, 9, and 8. The normal attack level is level 7 because of his passive talent, which increases the party member's normal attack level by 1. Alright, that should cover everything with my Tartaglia build, so now I'll quickly take him into a chamber in the Spiral Abyss so you can see his damage. So here we are in Spiral Abyss, floor 12, chamber 1. His gameplay is pretty straightforward, so I'll just quickly explain the team comp, then I'll just let things play out. For this team, I have Xingqiu, who provides healing, more hydro damage with Childe, and serves as a hydro energy battery. GOMC is a support that increases Childe's crit rate when he's in the radius of the rock walls, while Zhongli is here to provide CC with his burst and shields with his ability. The 2 Geo characters also give me the Geo Resonance, which is quite useful. The last thing I want to mention is that Tartaglia is a very rotational character if you're like me and have him at C0. For his gameplay, without something like C6, you want to go into melee stance in small intervals, then constantly switch back to your support characters to unload abilities. Staying in melee stance for longer periods of time is way too punishing, and he becomes dead weight on the team if you're stuck waiting out a long cooldown that's something like 35 seconds. You're going to notice that I don't actually have Tartaglia out all the time when I use him despite building him as a main DPS. With that, it's time to wrap up this guide. If you enjoyed this one or thought it was useful in some way, be sure to support both the video and the channel. I'll be pulling for Rosaria on one of my accounts, so be on the heads up for a Rosaria build guide in the coming days. Other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.